Excusez-moi, ne parler français. Professor Grinberg, Prime Minister Jospin, thank you for your leadership. Excellencies, and please let me recognize also my very special friend Marianne Lewin, who is the youngest surviving Holocaust twin, taken from Westerbork and then Bergen-Belsen. I want to thank Jerome Benezek, the director of CIVS, for his leadership in organizing this conference, and congratulate Michel, Jeannoutot, the chairman of CIVS, on this 20th anniversary of your newly expanded mandate. This is a recognition of the confidence that your government has in the work you've done for the past 20 years in so many areas that it's now being expanded into the area of spoliated art and cultural work. And yet, it's also a recognition that France has frankly done too little to give back cultural objects, has devoted too few resources to provenance research to identify stolen cultural objects in your public collection, and had an organizational structure and limitations which did not lead to the fullest restitution needed. Happily, this is now changing, and France is now going from being a laggard to a leader. But as Chairman Michel Jeannoutot has eloquently put it, time is of the essence. Now 75 years later, as he said, recognizing the victims and heirs of victims of spoliation, and endeavoring to make amends for injustices and losses. The Shoah was the most extensive genocide in human history. France actually has the best record of any occupied European country in saving a significant percentage of its Jewish population. And yet, of the 340,000 Jews in France at the beginning of the war, 75,000 were deported, largely non-French-born Jews. Because France was in the unique position of both being occupied and collaborating, your country had a particularly difficult time coming to terms with your history. And as we've heard, it was not until Jacques Chirac's historic and courageous statement of July 16, 1995, that he accepted in the name of France the terrible collaboration of the Vichy government. But the Shoah was not simply the greatest genocide in history, it was the greatest theft in history. And it was not simply an effort to enrich the Reich, or for that matter, the Vichy government, but to wipe out all vestiges of Jewish culture, stealing artworks, books, personal effects, photographs, musical instruments. Now, more than 75 years after the end of World War II, more than 20 years after the Washington Principles on Nazi-looted art that I'll discuss in a minute, and on the 20th anniversary of the CIVS, this is our last opportunity to add momentum and correct a historical injustice for the most ghastly crime in history, and to do our part to correct that injustice in our time. Experts estimate that a staggering 600,000 paintings were stolen, of which more than 100,000 were missing. And for sure, not all were masterpieces, as Professor Grinberg said. But they were masterpieces to the people from whom they were taken. They were their provenance. They were their connection to their families. In France alone, the Rosenberg Task Force, the EER, targeted 200 prominent collectors and stole 100,000 artworks and Jewish religious objects and millions of books during the 4 years of the occupation. From the outset, the United States was a leader in recognizing this confiscation. It's little remembered that as early as January 1943, the U.S. and our allies issued a declaration warning neutral countries not to trade in looted art and cultural objects, although they could not have imagined the scope of the theft. A year before D-Day, almost exactly a year before D-Day, June 23, 1943, President Franklin Roosevelt formed the American Commission for the Protection and Salvage of Monuments and Artistic Works, leading to the creation of a unique institution in the United States Army, embedded in the Army, the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives section of our armed forces called the Monuments Men. Art curators and historians who risked their lives to go along with the advancing American and Allied troops as they were heading east to Berlin, and their job, courageously done, was to track, to locate, and to protect, and in the years after the war, to place in collection points and then return more than 5 million works that they collected during their effort. Extraordinary. And they remained in Europe 6 years after the war. President Truman ordered the U.S. military as quickly as possible to return the looted objects, but that was more difficult than it appeared, because in the chaos of the end of the war, it was impossible to identify the actual owners of this mass number of looted objects. So following international precedent, the U.S. and British commands under Military Order 59 returned the art and cultural objects not to the individuals from whom it was stolen, but rather to the countries from whom it was taken, under the assumption that they would establish claims processes to identify the victims in their own countries. Unfortunately, this reliance was often misplaced, and many of the works which were returned to France, to the Netherlands, to Germany, were instead incorporated into their public museums rather than given back to their owners. Now, in fact, France began to take the right steps and deserves credit for it very quickly. In November of 1944, your own Commission on the Recovery of Artworks found more than 60,000 artworks, documents, and other valuables spoliated in France during the occupation and returned 3/4 of them to their owners and heirs between 1944 and 1950. Of the remaining 15,000 works, 2,143 were placed in the collection of your public museums, pending their restitution, what we call the MNR works, and the remaining were transferred to a state public authority. But as you recognized in your own 2018 report, and I quote, after an energetic and proactive restitution policy, a long period of neglect set in. Long, like 50 years long. And as we focused on the Cold War, the issue of restitution passed to the sidelines. Nazi looted art and other cultural objects simply dropped off the national and international agendas in the United States and throughout Europe. And then we owe it to 4 scholars in the United States who began to publish works about the dimensions of the theft and the lack of restitution. There was a conference held in 1995 at Bard College, which I learned about as I was in the State Department, and I decided that at the London Gold Conference in December 1997, over the objection, by the way, of the UK hosts, to add a speaker at the end on looted art, and then to announce that the U.S. government would host a conference devoted solely to confiscated artworks and cultural objects in December 1998. Here we got the help of the U.S. Congress, because in February of 1998, the House Banking Committee held a conference, a hearing, on looted art, at which the star witness was a French-born art leader, Philippe de Montebello, then the head of the New York Metropolitan Museum, our greatest museum, and speaking on behalf of the Association of Art Museum Directors. And I was there when he spoke. He recalled as a child, and I'm quoting him, keeping one step ahead of the Gestapo and the Vichy government while my father was serving in the resistance. Very powerful. But as a result of his testimony and pressure from the U.S. Congress and the administration, the Association of Art Museum Directors set up a task force which Montebello headed and were directed to do something about the absence of progress in looted art. And so in June of 1998, the American museums developed a set of published principles which in essence said, do the provenance research in all the museums to which the association has, over 200, publish those that are of dubious provenance, and then give back the art to the families from whom they were taken, and to do so, if possible, in non-litigation forms. In calling for the Washington Conference on Nazi-confiscated assets, my team and I at the State Department hoped to internationalize these American museum guidelines, because we knew that the vast majority of looted cultural objects and art were not in the United States, but were in Europe. There were 57 delegations, 13 non-governmental organizations in 44 countries who turned out for this conference 50 years after World War II on only a year's notice. And in early December of 1998, I negotiated, drafted, and we got 44 countries to agree to the Washington Principles on Nazi-confiscated art. There were 11 principles, but in summary, they were identify, publicize, restitute using just and fair solutions, to rectify this historical wrong. Now, I'll be very frank, because the French government was primarily involved in saying, you cannot make this legally binding as a treaty. We can't accept it. So I had to make it voluntary, subject to national laws. Not legally binding. And after the conference, people said to me, you've done nothing. They are just words. They won't have any impact. They'll be forgotten. Well, this conference today is evidence that they weren't forgotten. A great deal remains to be done, which I'll describe, but the Washington Principles, Mr. Prime Minister, are an incredible example of what a non-legally binding moral document based on justice can do when it happens to touch the hearts and minds of people. Now, I'm going to talk very frankly about the disappointments, because it wasn't legally binding. And I'm not trying to make more of it than we've gotten. Several countries have basically ignored them. Hungary, Poland, Spain and Russia. Go to the Hermitage and ask them to give you their Nazi looted art. There have been insufficient provenance research into collections and insufficient resources devoted to them. Most museums in Europe have done absolutely nothing, zero. And that's why it's so important that you are taking the lead with the allocation of significant additional resources and personnel to help the CIVS fulfill its new mandate. You should be proud that you're the only country where the effort to identify and return Nazi-confiscated artwork and cultural objects now rests in the head of government's office, the Prime Minister. In addition, you've substantially increased your budget and human resources devoted to this historically important work. You've strengthened your capability. You've been able to now self-initiate cases, not simply wait for people to come. And all of this is having a real impact, particularly as you go through your M&R collection. There are other disappointments, however. We were able to create advisory panels, but they have had significant flaws. Your own problem is your heritage code. The fact that you cannot deaccession artworks in your museums, even if they're found to belong to someone else and were stolen. The Netherlands has done too little with its collection in public museums, except for their so-called NK collection. Now, they made a good start, and then suddenly, a few years ago, they came up with what they called the balancing policy, under pressure from their museums who felt they were giving too much up. What is the balancing policy? That if the interest of the public museum in keeping the looted art is greater than that of the claimant or the heir, they get to keep it. That's totally 110% contrary to the spirit and letter of the Washington Principles, to which they signed on to. There are other problems with these advisory panels. For example, in Germany, which after all was the seat of confiscation, their so-called Limbach Commission in 15 years resolved 15 cases. Why? Because museums under their law did not have to participate in the panels. They just didn't show up. Now, that was rectified last year when I signed a joint declaration on behalf of the U.S. government with the art commissioner, Monica Grubers, in which now the German government, as a result of this joint declaration that I negotiated with her, will deny any museum that gets public funds, and they all do, those public funds if they don't participate, and also adds more money to it. That wouldn't have happened, by the way, had we not had the Berlin conference on the 20th anniversary. And I can't ignore the mixed report of the United States either. And I want to be very frank. I have no credibility if I come and point the finger at others and don't point it at us. Now, there are museums, the Metropolitan Museum, which has done it, the Boston Museum have done a very good job. I mean, the Met has digitized 350,000 pieces of art, and you can go and look for those that were obtained between 33 and 45. But we have a special responsibility, being the leader going back to World War II. Yes, some 30,000 items have been put on an internet portal, but by their own admission, the Association of American Museums says that that database is useless now, it's so outmoded. And even worse, after an initial burst of enthusiasm, what did the American museums start to do? When claims were brought, they cited the statute of limitations, they started latches, they started jurisdiction. again contrary to the Washington principles, which were to base claims on merit, not legal claims, and went even further, and before a claim was filed, went to the court to get an injunction barring the claim. Thankfully, Congress intervened in 2016. Congress does occasionally do some positive things, and passed the HERE Act, which set a federal statute of limitations claim of 6 years that only begins after the claimant has reason to know that there is a theft. And then in 2018, the JUST Act, which we're working on now in the State Department, which goes country by country with 46 countries who signed the Terezin Declaration, which incorporates the Washington principles, to give a report card. Now, having said that, the glass is really half full. There is much that has progressed, and now with advanced digital technology that didn't exist at the time of the Washington principles, there's no excuse for failing to have the widest distribution of information on Nazi-looted art and cultural objects. No state, no museum, no art gallery, no auction house, no private owner should want to hold Nazi-looted art. The achievements are, in fact, substantial to this moral, non-legally binding document. Philippe de Montebello put it very clearly himself. The art world, he said, has changed and will never be the same, because now museums and art dealers frequently, often, will look at the provenance of their art to see if they got it between 1933 and 45, and then identify it and return it. Provenance research itself was a word never heard before. It was a new profession. It's now expanded. Websites are increasingly enabling Holocaust survivors to locate their art, and more nations and non-governmental organizations are doing provenance research. In addition, there are 5 European nations that have created advisory panels to look at disputes: Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, France, and the UK. And international cooperation has begun to sprout. Here again, France is a leader. The CIVS has established a new Berlin branch to make it a focal point of Holocaust research and remembrance. And beyond this, and this is of seminal importance, France has recognized the importance of international collaboration. And it was at your initiative, your government's initiative, that you got all 5 of these advisory panels and created a network, a collaboration between the German, French, Dutch, British, and Austrian panels to share information, to publish the opinions on why they've turned down or accepted a particular claim, on developing a monthly or quarterly newsletter. And this new network of European restitution committees, which was only born in this very year, 2019, demonstrates what can happen when your country has taken the lead and catalyzed action to do justice. In addition, despite all the frustrations, there have been huge amounts of art returned. Austria, 30,000 objects. Germany, 16,000. And at the Berlin conference, after we signed this new declaration with Monica Gruters, denying public museums any German money if they didn't come forward, lo and behold, one museum, just a month or so afterward, found 42,000 looted art and cultural projects. One of the things I'm most proud of our principles is that the 2 great auction houses in the world, Christie's and Sotheby's, have their own full-time staffs, and they've signed new consignment agreements. If you want them to auction or sell your art, you have to agree to give them the right, which they exercise with full-time staffs, to research that work to see if it passed through European hands between 33 and 45, and if so, to give them the right to try to locate the owner. Christie's alone has identified 200 such claims. So let me conclude by a roadmap for the future. There were 11 principles of the Washington Principles. I'm going to give you more quickly 11 roadmaps for the future. First, we now appreciate, which we did not at the time of the Washington Principles, but did by the time of the Terezin Declaration, that theft didn't just mean somebody coming into one of the apartments that Anne mentioned. It meant forced sales for people to get exit passes to get out of Germany. It made flight sales to get into Switzerland. It's a much more sophisticated issue. It's not just somebody coming in and grabbing a piece of art. Second, that provenance research is expensive and it's hard work and it requires human resources. And here again is why your CIVS new mandate is so stirring as an example. Germany is now allocating money for private collections and private museums and private dealers to encourage them to do provenance art. And Israel has just started to launch a new nationwide program for provenance research for its museums and will provide public funding to train researchers. Third, descriptions of all collections of public museums should be put on accessible websites with accompanying provenance research. Fourth, nations should diligently research and identify all their collections. And let me be really clear now. This means that it's not enough for France to simply look at your M&R connection. It means going to the Jeu de Paume and going to the Pompidou and going to the Louvre and going to every public museum and hopefully private ones as well to determine if any are looted. Fifth, all countries that have de-accession laws, like your French Heritage Code, should change them. It's not right that this would bar the accession of art to legitimate owners when they're looted. Sixth, the Washington Principles applied not just to public museums, but to private collections as well. And since I mentioned Sotheby's and Christie's, I urge your own art collectors, your own auction houses, to adopt the kind of structures and human resources that Christie's and Sotheby's had so that you can check against the polluted sale in your private trade of looted art. Seventh, as you've done with CIVS, countries should establish one point of reference for claimants so they don't have to go from one agency to another. Eighth, there should be no time limit on bringing claims if their complete identification and location was not previously known. Ninth, all these national panels, Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, France, and the UK, should be posted when they make a decision on the internet like court decisions. And 10th, as I say as a former ambassador to the European Union, the EU has been totally behind the curve. But thankfully that's changing. In January of this year, the European Parliament passed landmark legislation recognizing the Washington Conference and the Washington Principles on Nazi-looted art, urged the European Commission to publicize this and urge its member states to incorporate these, and hopefully this will now get the European Union and Brussels and its institutions more deeply engaged. And last and most difficult, 11th, is heirless art, where there's no person, no family identified, not even an heir because they were all wiped out. How do we handle heirless art? This is directly covered by our concept of just and fair solutions in the Washington Principles. With improved databases, it's worth one last try to post these on the internet. You'll be surprised at people who may identify them. But after that's done, at the very least, make this an educative device. Put on your M&R collection, if no one claims it, that this was stolen from an unidentified Jewish family, so that young kids, generations from now, will say, this must have been from the Shoah. I understand. And Austria, by the way, and Hannah Lessig, my dear friend, is here, has come up with a very creative solution on heirless art. After making every effort to find victims, if they can't, if there are no heirs, they will sell the heirless art and use the proceeds for Holocaust survivors. In conclusion, all eyes are now on France. You have made a tremendous commitment. I have every confidence that you will fulfill the mandate in this area, as you've done in others that your government has given you. Thank you very much.